Okay, everybody, I'm back. Sorry for the technical difficulties. We were having trouble with our internet. Maybe the bandwidth or something like that. I'm not sure. We had to switch. Channels, so we're back now. And like I was saying, there is a. We turn the music down a little bit so you can hear what I'm saying. There is a Trump rally tonight. So I'm trying to get out here, and I believe it'll start at Mountain Time at 6 o'clock. So we should have plenty of time here to get you get done here so that you can see President Trump tonight. He's in Louisiana. There's a governor in Louisiana running, and Republican that he's going to be campaigning for. So he should be on here in just a little bit. Anyway, we're going to get started, and we're going to talk about the problems in Mexico. There's a lot going on in Mexico. I know many of you probably heard about the two sons of El Chapo getting caught, and then one of them got away, and then the police turned the other one loose based on the threats of the cartel folks, and that is not a good situation. And we have a country in Mexico that is a failed state, and it's out of control right now. So yesterday, from everything we can gather, there was an attack on a 3-car caravan, SUVs. This was a family of people living south of Douglas in Mexico. They were Mormons, although they were not affiliated with the Mormon Church. He said the family is part of a religious sect in Mexico. They identify as Mormon but have no connection to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City, Utah. So when I lived in Utah for several years, and I learned that there were still people in Utah, Mormons, practicing polygamy, and they were pretty much ostracized from the church. At least if anybody knew about it. There may have been some people that still involved with it that they kind of overlook. It's hard to figure all that out. But in southern Utah, there was a group of people, and I don't remember the guy's name, that they were after, law enforcement was after. So some of these Mormons that aren't no longer affiliated with the church but call themselves Mormons and practice polygamy, they leave the state, and apparently these people have been down in, they've had this land in Mexico for over 100 years, what I understand. I'm going to read you some details about that. So they do still practice polygamy, and the conditions for Utah to become a state, to get their statehood, they had to outlaw polygamy in the state. So I don't know if that was the only condition put on them, but that was one of the main ones. And so that's why the church frowns on it now, although, like I said, there were some people still practicing. They had more than one wife, and as a matter of fact, they had several wives. So anyway, last night on Channel 9 in Tucson, they covered a lot of this, and so I'm going to detail you some of this now. And said an attack in Mexico that left 9 shot to death and burned, including 4 small children and 2 infants, was not an accident, several members of the family tell KGUN 9. Their claims run counter to statements from Mexican authorities, who say they believe the attack may have been the case of mistaken identity. But Alex LeBaron, who is part of the large family, said the attack was carried out by organized crime groups in Mexico, cartels, and it is not the first such attack. The family is part of a religious sect in Mexico. They identify as Mormon, but have no connection to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. LeBaron says 2 members of the family, Benjamin LeBaron and Louis Widmar, were kidnapped and killed in 2009. He said members of the family testified to convict those involved. The family received government protection after that. LeBaron says that protection was later reduced to cover only those specific family members who testified in the case. They pleaded with the government for additional protection but did not receive it. Daniel LeBaron, another member of the family who lives in Kansas City, also tells Kagan 9 he believes the narrative of mistaken identity is wrong. He also alluded to the past incidents involving organized crime groups and the family. So that's what the family's saying. And a little bit about that community. The community whose members were attacked in Mexico has history with cartels, the University of Arizona expert says. A University of Arizona professor is providing new insight into the suspected cartel attack that left 9 U.S. citizens dead in Mexico. Today, they're talking 10, but anyway, as of this report last night, it was 9. The attacks in Mexico reflect drug wars, where non-cartel members are more and more likely to be caught in the violence. That's the conclusion of University of Arizona professor who studied the cartels and their impact. Dr. Javier Osorio of the University of Arizona School of Government says the offshoot Mormon community involved in this latest attack established itself in Mexico more than 100 years ago. They developed a large valuable farms and ranches. In recent years, drug gangs looking for new ways to make money targeted groups like this breakaway Mormon community for kidnapping and extortion, and the group fought back. Back in 2009, they were very outspoken and resistant against cartels coming into their communities, Dr. Osorio said. And these are pretty much a cultural business, ranchers. They are used to having guns for hunting, so they organize themselves to protect their communities, sometimes bearing weapons. Dr. Osorio says 10 years ago, cartel members killed one of the leaders of the offshoot. So that's some information that I hadn't heard until I watched Channel 9 last night, and I thought you folks might be interested in that. I'm not sure what the latest is today now. I saw something on Twitter that Mexico claims they caught a person responsible. Now, I can't hardly believe that, a person responsible. If this was a case of mistaken identity, why in the world would you shoot down children and women and then burn their bodies in the SUV? I mean, that makes no sense. So apparently, like I said, there are survivors of this horrible massacre up in a hospital in Tucson, and they are under guard. And evidently, it remains to be seen whether any of those survivors, are they old enough to tell the story, or even able or to tell the story? Are they too traumatized to even talk about it? So that's something right now we don't know. So anyway, it's a horrible thing. Governor Ducey has come out and recommended that Arizona citizens do not go to Mexico. He came with that today. It was printed in the Arizona Capital Times. And I can look that up right now, and let me see if I can find that little nugget of information. I'll see if I sent out a notice today on the Google group, and maybe that'll maybe I can bring that up right away. Let's see here. So yeah, here we go. Mark Daniels commented on this he was on with Tucker Carlson last night, talking about these people being terrorists and just like ISIS, which he's correct about. Senator Tom Cotton said President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador came into office almost a year ago saying that this strategy for dealing with the cartels was going to be more hugs, not bullets, Cotton said on Your World. That may work in a children's fairy tale, but not in the real world. When 3 American women and 6 American children are gunned down and burned alive, the only thing that can counter bullets is more and bigger bullets, Cotton said. If the Mexican government cannot protect American citizens in Mexico, then the United States may have to take matters into our own hands. And President Trump tweeted, and I saw this last night, one of his last tweets was, "This is a time for Mexico, with the help of the United States, to wage war on the drug cartels and wipe them off the face of the earth. We merely await a call from your great new president." Since then, I heard the president of Mexico said that he did not want to start a war right now. And, who knows? Is he being run by the cartels? Yeah, probably. There's a lot of people that suspect that. So, I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not. But anyway, he's apparently he doesn't want to do anything now. And so here's Doug Ducey. Doug Ducey urges Arizonans to heed travel advisories to Mexico. Governor Doug Ducey is urging Arizonans to heed advisories about travel into Mexico, even as he heads off to a conference in Hermosillo. Interesting. Please join me in praying for these Americans, those we've lost, those missing, and for the family and loved ones who are grieving. Said on Twitter this morning. There exists a longer-term advisory from the U.S. State Department about travel into Sonora, the state that borders directly with Arizona, specifically urges people to reconsider travel due to crime. It's not just Sonora. There are several of the provinces down in Mexico that are, they say not to travel to. They're a level 3 if you go to the State Department website. And we looked at that frequently recently. We had reason to do that as a relative traveled down there, and we were concerned about that. And it is not a good time to go down to Mexico, and so I would hope that people would heed that advice and not travel down there. There are many bad areas, particularly around the old American areas where it used to be so popular, like Acapulco and Puerto Panado, which is Rocky Point, and it's just not a good idea. It isn't safe, and they can't protect you. And although some people say, well, police can't protect you up here, well, there's a good chance they'll do the right thing up here. But up here, you got your guns on you, and down there, you can't take weapons down there, so you're helpless. You're not going to be able to defend yourself. Now, how these Americans, these Mormons, get away with owning guns is an interesting thing too, but maybe that's the trade-off. Since the government's not going to protect them, they let them own guns and protect themselves. Who knows? Anyway, I'm going to, I hope we've given you some new information on all this. It's pretty interesting what we learned last night on KGUN 9, and we appreciate KGUN 9 News for that information. The story is on their website, kgun9.com, and you can go look at it. I'm sure they'll be talking more about it tonight on the local news. So you all stand by. I'm going to take like a 5-minute break. It looks like we got a good signal now. We got a green light. So give me about 5 minutes, and I'm going to start this panel discussion with the Center for Immigration Studies, and they're going to talk about immigration and terrorism, and particularly referencing what they learned from what's happened in Europe and how we can apply that to Mexico and our border, etc. So stand by, and we'll turn to that in just a few minutes. Hi, everybody. I'm back, and I'm going to start the panel discussion, Center for Immigration Studies. This is from this morning, and it's a very good panel, and I think you'll enjoy it. So I'm going to start it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Lot of light about the subject. In other words, the potential for terrorist infiltration across our border with Mexico. People sort of get a sense that there's some issue there, and politicians sometimes will talk about it, but often there isn't a lot of substance to that talk, and we're trying to remedy that situation. So first thing we're doing is releasing a paper today by Todd Bensman, who's Senior National Security Fellow with the Center for Immigration Studies. That paper's online as well as outside. It's online at our site, CIS.org. And Todd spent almost a decade at the Texas Department of Public Safety at the Intelligence and Counterterrorism Division, where he worked on issues related to terrorism across the border from Mexico into the United States. Longtime foreign correspondent before that, has traveled to Central America most recently to look at this issue of what they call special interest aliens, mainly from people coming not from Mexico or Central America necessarily, but through those places, but originally from countries where there are real terrorism issues. So Todd's going to present the findings of his paper, and then we're going to have two commenters. The first is Robin Simcox. He's the Margaret Thatcher Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, which is a great title. I'd love to be a Margaret Thatcher Fellow. And he specializes in just this issue, counterterrorism and national security. And he recently authored The Asylum Terror Nexus, How Europe Should Respond, which is the subject of the, related to the subject of the paper that Todd is releasing today on the experience Europe had with terrorist infiltration across their borders and what we might learn from that. And then the second commenter is Jim Conway, who was a special agent for more than 25 years in the FBI, specialized in international terrorism, and among other jobs was program manager for counterterrorism and counterintelligence at our embassy in Mexico City, where he dealt with this actual issue of special interest aliens using Mexico and the Mexican border as a way potentially to gain access to the United States. So we're going to go in that order, and then when the presentations are done, we'll take some Q&A. Todd?
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate that.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. So this is a descriptive study that we use to tally, to quantify a relatively new phenomenon in terrorist travel happening in Europe over the last few years, where violent jihadist extremists manage to get themselves into the migrant flows, cross over the external EU borders, and then to conduct attacks, and also to plot and to hide. This is a kind of a new phenomenon that we hadn't heard about, and certainly nobody has really quantified what happened in Europe, and actually it's still happening now. The point of this study is to not only just quantify it, but also to provide at least an exploratory analysis of what it means and how that might apply to American border security and enforcement policy. A little context first. In the years after 9/11, this whole idea, this notional idea that terrorists could cross our southern border in like a second wave of attacks occupied pretty expensive real estate. It had enough gravitas to drive legislation and strategic planning, and it actually had some esteem in Homeland Security circles for a while. And then over time, because we didn't have a lot of attacks, we didn't see a lot of attacks from that quarter for various reasons, it lost gravitas. It lost its importance. It wasn't really happening that much. Not only that, but we also had some reports that turned out to be false about terrorists crossing the border, and these further damaged this idea, so that by the time President Trump was mentioning it about a year ago, there was significant pushback and ridicule about this subject. But then came November 2015, Paris. 6 distinct attacks in Paris. It turned out that, and 130 dead, hundreds wounded, terrible attack there, and then a few months later, Brussels. And it trickled out in the aftermath of those that some of the suicide bombers had penetrated the migrant flows, the massive caravans that were unending coming from the Middle East into Europe overland, claiming asylum, and that they had used that as camouflage to get in. But even then, it was not acknowledged, in spite of the fact that we've had continuous attacks in the years since 2015, all the way to the present. We're still having attacks and plots that involve people who entered the migrant trails overland and went over and engaged in activity. So the point here was that when the White House released its national counterterrorism strategy, the strategy document mentioned this as a threat to the United States. It didn't go into a whole lot of detail, but it was really the first time that a major national strategic document actually cited this. And then it made the mistake of only saying that there were 2 terrorists that did this, that were in Paris, and it struck me as obvious of the need to quantify how often this happened. Nobody had really done this. So we endeavored to try to quantify to the extent that we can what had happened. So the idea here is that we want to take this issue and give it its rightful seat at the Homeland Security table. We want there to be discussion, and we want this issue to be taken seriously, because now it's no longer theoretical, it's proof of concept. So I'll just let my findings by the numbers. It's in the paper that was published today. We looked at the period between 2014 and 2018. And during that period, we noted 104 Islamist extremists entered the EU's external borders using long-haul irregular migration methods to get over the border. This, like I said, established proof of concept that this was a kind of a new tactic in terror travel, no longer some kind of crazy notion. I also want to mention that I believe that's likely an undercount, because for one thing, in 2019, these attacks and plots have continued, and they were beyond the scope of my study, so I didn't count them. And also there were attacks and plots prior to 2014 that also were not tallied. We believe the number is probably far more than 104, and as time goes on, that number is going to grow, because this is an ongoing, unfolding story. Of the 104, they carried out 16 distinct attacks, 32 thwarted plots. 28 individual migrants or people who posed as migrants completed actual attacks. 37 were arrested or killed as a result of thwarted plots, and 39 others were arrested for general terrorist activities. And by that I mean, you know, there was a commander who chopped heads off somewhere in a village in Syria, and then they crossed in with the migrants and they hid, or we didn't know what they were going to do. They were a higher risk, but it was illegal to have been part of a foreign terrorist organization, and so they were arrested. This is interesting to us. More than 40 of the migrants who were involved in completed attacks and thwarted plots were purposefully deployed into the migrant flow. This was ISIS, their external operations branch, trained, organized, equipped, funded, a purposeful deployment using this tactic to gain access to target countries. Of those 40, 27 formed what we call a supercell. They were mainly involved in the Paris and Brussels attacks, and then the rest of them were either killed or arrested. Some 23 were self-propelled lone offenders who arrived in small familial or friendship groups, non-deployed small cells. 29 were returning foreign fighters of European citizenships who couldn't come back the normal way, so they came in posing as migrants with false Syrian passports as though they were war refugees. The vast majority of them were from ISIS, 75 of them, and the vast majority, and there were also some Taliban and al-Nusra and some Chechens involved in there too. The vast majority of these terrorists took what's known as the Western Balkans route. This would entail an entry into Greece and then north through the Balkan countries to Hungary. Remember, Hungary built a fence, and then from Hungary they would head west into crossing the European frontier and claim some form of international protection like asylum, but there were some other forms as well. Which brings me to an interesting point about asylum. We looked at the period of time that folks who had come through, applied for asylum, and then conducted attacks or were arrested. The average period of time that they were in Europe was 11 months. Some were there for 30 months, some were there for a few days before they were caught. But that allowed for the use of asylum processes and international protection processes to incubate plots. There's obvious differences. I'd like to get into a few of those between our border and the European situation. For one thing, there are far fewer numbers coming into the United States through its borders. We estimate between 3,000 and 4,000 annually. That's a tiny percentage compared to the number that were coming, the vast majority coming through our border are from the same countries as were coming through the European borders, but they were coming in by 2.5, 3 million. So you have very large haystacks and more needles in those haystacks and a higher probability of attack. The reason that we have smaller numbers coming here is because you have to have an intercontinental flight. That entails money, documents, and it's more expensive. So we're looking at maybe $4,000 for a Somali to get into Europe and $30,000 to get to the United States. So you're going to have smaller numbers, smaller volumes. That's a good thing. Also, the relative capabilities of European security services and ours significantly different. The Europeans were not prepared in any way for this. They had very limited counter migration operations and capability there. But the United States, because after 9/11 we did initially take this seriously, we installed counter-smuggling, and we have watch lists, interoperable database systems, better screening for migrants coming through. So the U.S. is better positioned to apply some security screening to migrants who are coming from those far distances. Nevertheless, we apprehend about 20 watch-listed individuals at our border or en route who are on U.S. watch lists. That's a good thing because we're apprehending them, okay? So the conclusion to draw from that is that the threat to the U.S. border is lower than it was for Europe, because very high migration from Muslim-majority countries to an unprepared Europe resulted in terror attacks, while low migration to a more prepared United States resulted in apprehensions and probable terrorist infiltrators at the border and preventions of attacks. So we've gotten lucky in that regard. However, I would say that there's still a moderate, high consequence threat that persists to the United States from that avenue, and we ought to take into account what happened in Europe. There's a few things, and I'll wrap it up. One is that extremist groups abroad saw that what they did in Europe was highly successful. It worked. That terror travel tactic over borders posing as migrants worked. And success often breeds success. So we should assume that there is an awareness among foreign groups that may want to deploy, or even just individuals who might want to self-deploy and come through our border and spend the money. The longer distance, the higher cost, and better U.S. security would not deter a determined terrorist. Nobody's going to be like, oh, that's $50,000, I won't do that. If you're determined, you can do that, and they will. The Central American crisis showed that our border management systems can be crashed, just like in Europe. And lastly, the asylum loophole, major problem even in non-crisis time for the United States. Europe's asylum system was completely crashed. Those terrorists took full advantage, exploited those wait times and loopholes. In a non-crisis situation, we have the same, if not longer, wait times and backlogs and loopholes in our asylum system. It's only going to help a determined jihadist come through. And with that, I know my time's out, and I'll pass the dais, I guess.
Great, thank you. Robin?
Thank you. Thank you to you all for coming, and thank you to the Center for Immigration Studies for having me. I'm, as you guessed, from Europe originally, so this is a subject very close to my heart for obvious reasons, considering what's happened over the past few years. So I've been spending a lot of the last few years going back and forth from here to Europe, talking to government officials from all over Europe about this issue. So I'm going to speak a little more broadly on the back of Todd's comments about how I see the situation in Europe at the moment and how we got here. So I live in one of those pretty liberal DC neighborhoods where there's a lot of those signs you see up, those front yard signs which says everyone welcome here, refugees welcome, all that sort of stuff. The kind of sign of inclusiveness and tolerance and all that. Whenever I see those, I kind of think Chancellor Merkel's asylum policy in 2014-15 is kind of like the DC yard slogan adopted to government. Because in 2014-15, there was millions of people fleeing from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, obviously humanitarian crises there. Heading to Europe, there was also people coming from migration coming to Europe, especially Italy, from Africa. And the enormous flow of people was placing unsustainable pressure on landing ports in Greece and in Italy, threatening the territorial integrity of the Balkans. And Chancellor Merkel responded by opening Germany's borders, letting in a mix of obviously genuine asylum seekers, but also alongside some economic migrants, and as Todd has discussed, also those who are looking to infiltrate Europe for explicitly nefarious purposes. So over 1.5 million asylum seekers arrived in Germany between 2015 and 2018, almost 1 million in 2015 alone. It was essentially the open borders dream coming to fruition, really. Such were the numbers, and so unprepared were the European border agencies. Most people would just wave through with cursory or sometimes non-existent background checks. But Chancellor Merkel would soon discover that if you invite in the world, you also invite in the world's problems. And this has particular relevance, of course, to terrorism. I've done a lot of research in this area. I think my numbers show there's almost 1,000 people have been injured or killed in terrorist attacks in Europe, featuring asylum seekers or refugees since 2014. and that 16% of the overall plots Europe has faced in that time period have contained asylum seekers or refugees. Todd already referred to the Paris November 2015 attack, which was the most prominent example of the exploitation of migrant routes. But I think one of the most striking examples to me is Germany. So in Germany, there were only 11 plots disrupted between 2000 and 2013. Not a single terrorist atrocity took place in that time. After the migration crisis, the threat spiked. You had terrorist attacks committed by asylum seekers in Berlin, in Ansbach, and Hamburg, and other places as well. There's also been this, and this has been very, very difficult for German authorities to know how to even discuss this. There has been high-profile but multiple rape murder cases of teenage girls in Germany that were committed by adult asylum seekers who claimed to be minors to get into the country. There was the mass sexual assaults you saw on New Year's Eve of 2015. These are obviously really, really rare cases, exceedingly rare cases, but they're high profile, they make a splash, and there have been of significant concern to the general public in Germany. Then you can look at a place like Sweden. So Sweden took in 163,000 asylum seekers in 2015. As a percentage of their overall population, that's like you guys taking in 5.2 million people in a single year and expecting everyone to integrate seamlessly. Gang violence in Sweden, it's an unfortunate fact, largely emanates from immigrant communities. There's been a sharp rise in firearms murders in the country. The statistics they have on sexual assaults show they're being committed disproportionately by those with an immigrant background. And one recent study showed that more than 75% of asylum seekers in Sweden claiming to be children were actually adults. Austria, Italy, and others in Europe are facing similar challenges on this. So how has Europe responded? It's not ignored the problem altogether. The numbers have dropped year on year since 2015. 185,000 people arrived to Germany in 2018, which is still over 15,000 a month, but is obviously less than the almost 1 million that arrived in 2015. When you look at the causes behind the drop, the EU has tripled funding for border management and migration issues, but I tend to think the more pertinent reason is that in March 2016, the EU signed an agreement with Turkey in which Erdogan was promised 6 billion euros in financial aid to be used by the Turkish government specifically to finance projects for Syrian refugees. Let's be honest about what it was. It was essentially a bribe from the European Union to try and keep Syria's problems in Turkey rather than more in Europe than they already were. The issue of that, of course, with that is that Europe is essentially being held hostage to the whims of Turkish politics. Last month, Erdogan threatened to send every refugee being held in Turkey to Europe because there was criticism from Europe about Turkey's military incursion into Syria. Don't expect that to be the last time such a threat is made by Erdogan. So another option for Europe is the potential deportation of those who have no legal right to be in the country. Germany's had significant problems in this. One of the reasons with Germany is that deportation is not a task for the federal government, but one that falls to the individual states. So authorities in the south, in states such as Bavaria, tend to be a bit more conservative. They've taken a little bit of a tougher approach. In the more liberal north, in Berlin, for example, authorities have been more reluctant to pursue deportations. There's some judges who've been unwilling to approve things like bone x-rays, for example, in order to ascertain an asylum applicant's age, saying that it's discriminatory. The German Medical Association is still speaking out against checking claimants' ages during the asylum process. And these blockades to deportation mean that as a result, Germany has actually begun to pay asylum seekers to leave. it's offering funds as high as €3,000 in an attempt to lower the numbers overall. That's problem isn't just confined to Germany. In January 2016, Sweden projected that up to 80,000 of their asylum applicants would be rejected. One official told me that even though that's true, probably about 50,000 of those will end up staying. And that's not a specifically post-2000. The scale is significant and different post-2015, but it's not just a post-2015 problem. The ability to deport those without identity papers or those fleeing from war zones or countries with bad human rights records has been an ongoing concern for European nations. The guy who carried out the attack in Stockholm in April 2017 was exactly one of these cases. He was from Uzbekistan. Sweden can't deport people to Uzbekistan because it does have a terrible human rights record. He eventually ended up going to ground. The authorities lost track of him, and he carried out his attack. Those kind of incidents, I think, help explain perhaps what is the most important response, and one that we are still trying to figure out, I think, in Europe, how exactly to analyse this. But that's the response from the general public. In Germany, millions have turned to Alternative for Germany, AfD, got about 6 million votes in September 2017, an explicitly anti-immigration party. There's a rise in support for Le Pen in France. She got almost 11 million votes in spring 2017. The Swedish Democrats gaining strength in Sweden. And I think the migration surge certainly played in the role of the decision of the UK to leave the European Union, or its ongoing attempt to leave the European Union, in the summer of 2016. And we see a similar picture elsewhere in Europe. So just some observations on today. Migration to Europe is still obviously occurring from the Middle East, Africa, and other regions. The Balkans land route, which ends up in Germany or Austria, or the route via the central Mediterranean, remain the most popular way of accessing Europe. With the central Mediterranean, there's optimism in Italy that the route via Libya is increasingly difficult to use as more parts of the border are being patrolled. That means that more popular alternatives to Italy are increasingly Spain and Greece. And we're also seeing travellers from West Africa using Morocco and Turkey as jumping off points for entry to Europe, as they don't need a visa to access those countries. And so how this is applicable to the US, as Todd says, the US has taken a more guarded approach to this than Europe. It's not immune to the problem. But there was a case recently where the FBI thwarted a plot by a Syrian refugee to bomb a Pittsburgh church in the name of ISIS. And I think you also see that one of the interesting things in Europe is that it's some of the more developed countries in Africa, for example, rather than extremely poor ones, that are seeing an increase in migrants to Europe because there is more cash to pay smugglers to try and get them out of the country. It's often impossible for truly impoverished countries to do the same, which I think has some applicability to the US migration question as well, with regards to Central America. So it's easy to talk. I'd wrap up by saying just, I guess, general thoughts on this. It's really easy for us all to talk about inclusion in society. It makes us feel good. It's not going to upset anyone, and it's easy to do. The tough conversations to have about exclusion. It's more unpalatable, of course it is, but it's equally important. America, like Europe, has a choice. Is it home for everyone who turns up and says it is? The concept of the nation state has proved itself to be the foundation for the most successful forms of governance ever created. Roger Scruton, the English philosopher, has said that the nation state is the largest extension of the first person plural you can do. It's the largest extension of we. And yet we see attempts, I think, at times to undermine this from people gambling that democracy can survive without any ability to decide who is included and who is excluded, and can survive with a diminished sense of national loyalty. I come back to my DC yard signs of everyone is welcome here, because not everyone can be welcome in a certain place if you want to retain a sense of national identity and control over borders, that's as true for America as it's true for every other single country in the world. And my hope would be that America doesn't have to learn some of those lessons in the same painful way that we in Europe have over the past few years. And with that, I will wrap up and pass on to Jim.
Thank you, Robin. Jim?
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, and good morning. It's an honor to be here with such an esteemed panel, and thank you to the Center for Immigration Studies. I'm going to talk a little bit about the southern border of the United States, sort of from an operational perspective and based on my time down there at the U.S. Embassy as the program manager for the FBI's portfolio involving counterterrorism and counterintelligence. Just by way of background, I spent about 26 years in the FBI, and I actually worked organized crime for about 10 years, focused on Chinese triads, Italian mafia, Russian organized crime, and so forth. And in the mid-90s, I got interested in terrorism based on some research, and because terrorism was beginning to move up in terms of priority in the FBI. After Pan Am 103, after the World Trade Center 1 bombing in 1993, the FBI was beginning to prioritize more radical fundamentalist Islamic extremism as a target and as an issue regarding national security for the United States. So I got interested in that, and it was a good fit for me because working organized crime, you're looking at hierarchical groups, you're looking at groups that are usually drawn along ethnic lines or ideology lines. Many of the techniques that the FBI used, I could transfer over to counterterrorism, and those are things like electronic surveillance, physical surveillance, analyzing the movement of money, developing human informants, and so forth. So it was a good fit for me. I spent a few years working in a joint terrorism task force in Houston, which basically focused on, I was on the international side, we were focused on Hezbollah, Al-Ghamad al-Islamiyah, we were focused on Al-Qaeda at that time, which was growing significantly. So that was really my focus. I also had an opportunity because I was interested in working internationally. I got involved with our legal attaché program, and I had the blessing and the honor to work overseas in South America after the Amia bombing. I worked with the Chileans and the Argentinians. I worked with the Israelis on a case involving the shipment of U.S. Army surplus goods from the United States to Israel that was targeting Israeli soldiers along the southern Lebanon border. So I got a chance to work with the Israelis. I got a chance to work with the Brits. I got a chance to work with the Argentinians and the Hezbollah issue down there, Iranian-backed Hezbollah. So I got an interesting perspective of the sort of the operational profile of international terrorism and how it differed in different parts of the world and how it affected our national security. After 9/11, the FBI decided they're going to put an international terrorism desk in Mexico. Prior to that, the FBI office at the U.S. Embassy, the Office of the Legal Attaché, was pretty much focused on drug trafficking, extortion, kidnappings, kidnappings of parental kidnappings and so forth, things of that nature. After 9/11, the focus of terrorism was front and center for everybody, for policymakers, for lawmakers, and for the FBI. We had been punched pretty hard in the stomach, and I was sent down to Mexico. I went down to Mexico, and I initially did an assessment, and I looked at the situation. What are the issues here vis-a-vis national security, vis-a-vis international terrorism, as it could impact the United States? And it was a different time, and in the days after 9/11, failure was not an option, and that became very clear from my bosses in Washington. Failure is not an option. We were focused, and the issues and the threat stream that was coming in every day kept us up at night. Let me talk a little bit about the threat stream and what we were looking at and what the issues were. We looked at the demographics in Mexico, and in a country of 87 million people, there were really only about 6,000 Muslims in the country. There were a few small Islamic communities, and we soon realized that there were very, very minimal extremist elements within those communities. So that was not the focus. What became the focus for us was the very sophisticated global smuggling networks that were moving people from all over the world, with the end stop, the final stage, being northern Mexico, and moving those people into the United States. I remember looking at a map that Border Patrol and CBP when we started working cases and we started working operations, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, we looked at a schematic of the different groups that were smuggling special interest aliens, which I'll articulate in a few minutes for you, but into the United States, and it looked like a spaghetti map, where people were being moved from the Middle East, from East Africa, from South Asia, through Europe, through Brazil, through Central America, through Belize, through El Salvador, across the Panamanian Isthmus, but it all ended, all roads led to northern Mexico, where these folks were then smuggled into the United States. One of the things I looked at was, and as I began my assessment, and I talked to folks who were much smarter than me, folks that were working Border Patrol intelligence, people in CBP, people in U.S. immigration who knew a lot more about the assessment of the numbers than I did, I started realizing that 1.5 million people cross the U.S. border in both directions, legally and illegally, every day. And I started thinking about it, and I said, wow, those are some big numbers. And I was told that anywhere from 5 to 10% of those people that crossed the border were OTMs. And I said, what are OTMs? Other than Mexicans. They were people that came from other countries other than Mexicans. And then we drilled down and we said, what percentage of these people are special interest aliens? And those are folks that come from a country where there is a significant presence of terrorist organizations or terrorist support activity. Countries like Sudan, Somalia, Pakistan, Lebanon, Iraq, Tunisia, and so forth and so on. And that's what we really focused on. And that's the thrust of our topic today. You know, when I kind of did that, I sort of looked at the overlay of intelligence and anecdotally what we were looking at. And again, what I looked at was the fact that post 9/11, when Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was captured, the mastermind of 9/11, and they interviewed him, they interrogated him, they began to find in his writings and in his documents and on his person numerous references to Mexico and to the U.S. border. Adnan al-Shukri Juma, who was considered the 20th hijacker, he got spooked just before 9/11 and got out of the country. But he was taking flight lessons with the 19 hijackers in Florida, in Miramar, Florida, prior to 9/11. He spooked and got out of the country. We tracked him in Panama carrying a Trinidad passport. So we knew he was somewhere in Central America, Latin America. We never were able to find him. In 2013, Pakistani special forces shot and killed him in northern Pakistan. So, but we knew that he was in Latin America at that time. Numerous detainees when I went down at Gitmo, and folks that were being interviewed in Afghanistan and Iraq made numerous references to Mexico and the southern border of the United States. So hearing all that, suddenly my attention span moved up significantly. It became clear to me that the 2,000-mile border between the United States and Mexico, there was a nexus to illegal immigration and human smuggling. There was a nexus and a connection to terrorism. Anecdotally, we knew that 3 of the 19 hijackers were overstays in the United States. We knew that 7 of the 19 hijackers had bought illegal fraudulent documents from day laborers here in Northern Virginia. DHS told me that there were approximately 115,000 special interest aliens currently illegally in the United States, and 6,000 of them had actually been deported and had defied those deportation judgments and remained in the United States. So certainly got my attention. From my perch in Mexico City, having conducted this assessment, it became clear to me that the greatest concern was the overwhelming presence of these sophisticated human smuggling organizations that existed and utilized Mexico as the final staging point to move illegal aliens into the United States. I'll just tell you operationally, what we did is, at the U.S. Embassy, I chaired a working group with one of my colleagues from the intelligence community, and we said, we got to work smarter, not harder. And basically, we put together a program to identify those smuggling organizations, those smuggling networks. We did that through good, hard investigative efforts. And it's difficult because when you're overseas, as an FBI agent, I may as well not carry my credentials and my badge because they're useless. I'm on foreign soil. I have no authority to conduct an investigation. I had to do that in liaison with my partners in country. And in Mexico, we worked very closely with the Attorney General's office, we worked with the National Police, we worked with the Mexican Intelligence Service, CIS. And they knew they had skin in the game, and they worked with us because 9/11 impacted them. And I used to make it very clear to them that your resorts are empty. Your rental car places and your restaurants are going out of business. Your number 2 industry is tourism. 9/11 kicked you or punched you in the gut too. And the Mexicans were on board, and we worked very, very well together. But in terms of our operational perspective or our tack is to identify those smuggling organizations through good intelligence collection. The Mexicans cooperated with us. There were numerous SIAs being held in Mexican detention centers. I remember at one point in Tapachula, Mexico, which is down on the river of the Guatemalan-Mexican border, there were 700 East Africans being held in detention there, Somalians and Sudanese. The Mexicans worked with us. We collected a lot of intelligence from their documents, from their telephones and so forth, and we were able to identify the smuggling organizations and the people that were pulling the triggers for those organizations. And we targeted those organizations. We not only targeted them in Mexico, we targeted them globally. The French, the Greece, and others worked operations with us, and we were able to shut down some of those groups. Just anecdotally, I know I'm running out of time, I just want to mention a couple things. A couple cases that came to mind down there and were clear to me was, we knew that, and this was as I arrived, George Tajirian, who ran Babylonian travel agency, he was an Iraqi who smuggled hundreds and hundreds of Palestinians and Middle Easterners into Mexico and ultimately into the United States. George had an extremely sophisticated organization. George was actually an Olympic rower for Iraq during the Olympics, I think 1980 or something. But he had a very successful travel agency, and he had a very sophisticated smuggling organization. Another case that I worked very closely with my colleagues at CBP, David Ramirez in particular, a good friend of mine, David and I still remain friends, was the Salim Bukhadar case, Salim Bukhadar Musharraf case, and you can read about that. This was a Lebanese smuggling organization, extremely sophisticated. Bukhadar owned the Lebanese Cafe in Tijuana, Mexico, and he had an entire global operation smuggling Lebanese into the United States. He had a whole cadre of attorneys in San Diego that worked for him. He had an extremely sophisticated operation. He actually had co-opted the Mexican Consul General in Beirut, Imelda Ortiz Abdullah, and she worked with him, and she was selling Mexican visas for his subjects that were being brought into Mexico. One of the things that made Bukhadar stand out notoriously more than anything was he actually smuggled a guy by the name of Mahmoud Karani, who was the brother of Haider Karani, the military head of security for Hezbollah. And the FBI captured him in Mexico. He was brought into the United States, and he was moved into Detroit, and the FBI, when they arrested him, they found a ton of videos and jihadist material related to Hezbollah. The Somalian Sudanese smuggling group was run by a guy named Mohammed Kamel Ibrahim, Samson Lovelace, and those folks were wrapped up in 2008. So we worked a lot of those cases and successfully, thank God. I'll just wrap up by saying I've been removed from, I haven't been in Mexico in a few years, but I'll tell you, I think based on everything we've said today, the issues become more complicated. And I do this when I train, when I do teaching and training overseas of counterterrorism groups, is the techniques and the problems and the issues are constantly evolving. Today, ISIS is part of the issue. That's complicated things. Everything's moved into cyberspace. And it's not just merely smuggling as we've seen in Europe, but not only those who are directed or operational, but those that could be inspired once they come into the United States. And I think my time's up. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. I'll just ask the first question. Anybody decide, anybody has anything to say, take it up, sort of pipe up. But, well, I guess two questions. But the first is, do you think with the crushing of the territorial area of the ISIS so-called caliphate, and now with al-Baghdadi whimpering and crying before he blew himself up, does that make it, is it more likely that we're going to see potential terrorist attempts, penetration attempts from ISIS on our border or our airports or anywhere else. Do you think that, I mean, does that factor in at all? Does it, you think it makes any difference in the likelihood of people trying to get in? Anybody? Yeah, Robin?
I think that looking at the numbers, the taking away the territory from ISIS has reduced the threat overall. It's taken away, obviously, a lot of their funding, that they can no longer extort people under their control. Their propaganda networks have gone down or been reduced. A lot of their high-value people have been killed, specifically people who are targeting Europe. So I'm pretty unambiguous about the fact that taking away the territory is going to reduce the threat overall, and I think the numbers bear that out so far.
Good. I've got more questions unless somebody has a question. Yeah, wait for the mic.
So this is a question for either Robin or Todd could probably answer. And Robin, you mentioned this in your comments about how Europe has had to respond to, migration flows. But you mentioned that they're largely, kind of stuck because the EU obviously can only do so much. They can give money to Erdogan. They can kind of do these Dublin agreements that everyone hates, especially, Italy and Greece. What do you think the EU can do moving forward as one body to, stymie flows instead of just relying on individual states?
The key part of that question is that as one body, this is the thing that paralyzes the European Union all the time, because you haven't half got some different opinions within that bloc about how to deal with this, and very radically different governments, very radically different approaches to migration, and with the way some of the voting patterns are going, I mean, who knows who will be in charge of some of these countries in the year to come. There's a recognition of the fact that this is an issue, which means there's more money, more funding, more focus being placed on it. They have seen some kind of temporary borders being put back up, actually, within certain countries that are especially impacted by it. I think that the philosophical issue, though, I think is irresolvable. European people feel very, very differently on this. Like, look at East Europe v West Europe approaches to migration. This is not resolvable. So I think you can do stuff at the edges, and they have done stuff with funding to deal with Erdogan and various other things. But the philosophical part of it, I think, is unfixable.
I had actually another question myself, and that is, some of this is speculation. Obviously, it's all speculation, really. But we faced actually something very similar to what Europe saw, in the sense that Obama didn't actually say anybody can come in and they'll be able to stay. But our policy kind of was like that, and that's what we saw starting in a small way in 2012, really picked up in 2014. We've taken hundreds of thousands of people who were let into the country. They overwhelmed the system in a similar way as happened to Europe. And we have a decaffeinated, low-calorie version of that problem, because most of them were from Central America, which, while there might well be problematic people, they're not likely to be Islamist terrorists. But my question is, what do we do about the people who may well have used that flow to already get into the country? That's kind of my point, because even if there were no, Islamist terrorists among the Hondurans making bogus asylum claims, those large groups of people crossing all at once left the rest of the border in that sector open, and who knows what came across there. My point is, what can we do now that we're sort of turning that flow down a little bit, but it went on for several years? What do we do about cleaning up what may have happened already?
I can address that through example, an emblematic example, which is that one of the post 9/11 policies that we implemented in a Homeland Security context was, remember that when people come to the border and they hit the border, especially special interest aliens, they are unknown to us. They usually don't even have identification with them. They just say, my name is Ahmed and I'm from Ethiopia or Somalia. And so one of the ways that we decided to counter that problem was through direct eye-to-eye threat assessment interviews. And for a time, the FBI was doing it, then ICE intelligence, that when they got into our detention centers, we would take the time to spend as much time as possible going through pocket trash and interviewing them and getting a sense of whether or not they were being deceptive, which of course would make them ineligible for asylum. Almost all of them make asylum claims. And that one-on-one interaction was highly valuable, not just at the border, but in Mexico and en route, some of the countries en route. And I think what happens is that when our border systems are crashed, like they were, that doesn't happen as much. Everybody's busy. And I think that there's a gap through which it would be very easy for somebody who was hiding their identity and motives and true selves to kind of come right on in and bond out without the, even in normal non-crisis periods. It's my understanding that those direct assessments, interview assessments, were not happening anywhere near 100% like they were supposed to. A very key counterterrorism program with that.
Jim?
Yeah, and you know, one of my big concerns with the advent of the cartel wars, with the election of President Calderon in 2006, the Mexicans had a lot on their plates. I mean, there was really a drug war going on in the country. And that certainly took their resources, changed the landscape for them. And could they help the gringos with their counterterrorism program? Certainly not as much as they did between 2002 and 2006, because their intelligence services, their police, their courts, their prosecutors were really focused on the drug war. So we lost that, and that sort of dovetails into what you're talking about. When you've got literally caravans of hundreds of thousands standing at the border, does that open the opportunity for more sophisticated bad guys and folks that could be linked to terrorism? In my view, absolutely.
Hello, this is a question for Todd. So you said there were 104 terrorists who'd crossed borders into Europe, but between those years, 2014 to 2018, there were millions of asylum refugees who were coming. I know Robin said there were 1 to 2 million in Germany alone. And so that ratio is pretty small when it comes to refugees who were actually terrorists and refugees who had legitimate claims. And I know several years ago it was a talking point that you were more likely to be killed in a car accident or injured by a car than you were to be a victim of a terrorist attack. So why is that ratio concerning, at least in regards to the US or even in Europe?
So it is true that if you were to do the math on this, that you would put a decimal point and then a 000 with maybe some numbers trailing off into infinity, that the number 104 terrorists, if you were to compare it against the total number of millions that had come in, is very small, minuscule. But I would argue that what Europe shows us more than anything is that small numbers have extremely high consequences. And you could also argue that 19 hijackers in the United States sent us off to war for 20 years, plus a bunch of other terrible things. But in Europe, I'll just say that the consequences went far beyond body count. We had about 170 dead and maybe 900 or so wounded in various attacks that are still going on. But as our colleague Robin pointed out, those terror attacks, even more so than the immigration from foreign, really alien countries, drove electoral outcomes throughout the continent. We saw it in the last couple of years, and when you study the polling that was being taken consistently during the period of these attacks, you can see that the primary interest in Europe, and especially in these countries, was these terror attacks, stop these terror attacks at all costs, whatever it takes, and a linkage of the terrorism to the immigration. far more so than like some kind of xenophobia or nativist, right-wing feeling, was that average Europeans were animated by these attacks in a way that affected electoral outcomes in a major way all through the country. That is, for 104 people, a significant outcome by itself. But there was more. The EU spent just billions. They're still spending. We don't have an accounting, but I mean, hundreds of billions of dollars, new expenditures in security measures and policies to stop this terror wave, and also to stop the immigration that was perceived as bringing the terrorists in. You had a very costly 3-month-long military campaign, U.S.-led. It's very rarely connected to this issue, but it most certainly is connected.
In Syria, you mean?
In Syria, to close the Manbij Gap. The Manbij Gap was seen as the spot where ISIS was deploying its terrorist operatives into the migrant flows. That was viewed by DOD and American policymakers as unacceptable, and we started a bloody campaign to close that gap. We had the Schengen Zone Treaty, which was designed to have enable internal flow of goods and people within Europe, is over. Since 1995, that treaty had, up until the 2015-2016 Paris attacks, had allowed all that free movement, but most of those countries have now reinstituted internal border controls, no more Schengen zone, and they've been renewing those. And when you read the documents that support the decisions, they're public documents, that support the decisions of shutting down the Schengen zone, it's terrorism and national security. So that's a significant continent-wide consequence of 104 people. It goes beyond that. My colleague mentioned Brexit. Brexit started as a result of the Paris and Brussels terror attacks. There were other factors, sure, for the Brexit, but certainly it started because of those terror attacks. So we could say that 1 or 2 or 3,000 or 4,000 special interest migrants might have a needle in that haystack, but boy, when 1 or 2 or 3 come over, you can expect significant consequences. And I would argue that as a country, we should put that on the table and respond with policies that take into account the consequences, not the number.
Rob?
Yeah, just a very quick addition to that is that, and this isn't just to do with the asylum question, but just terrorism in Europe generally. You just feel it. It feels different. You see armed police more than you ever used to. All the barricades that have been put up around tourist sites, you see it all the time. I just got back from London last night, where you see around Westminster Bridge all the barricades that used to be up that weren't previously because there'd been a vehicular attack there. There was the thing I always think of, the incident or non-incident, December 2017, which was when I guess Europe was sort of at its most alert after the series of attacks that had taken place, including 4 in Europe, 4 in London, in the UK that year. You started getting reports through on social media that loads of people had been killed in Oxford Street, one of the busiest shopping roads in London. There'd been at some celebrity, I forget who it was, some pop star tweeted saying, "I've heard gunfire, taking cover." He fled, massive panic everywhere on the streets of London, and nothing had happened. 2 people got into a fist fight on a platform at a tube station. This massive rumour had circulated, and it was chaos, and it was over nothing. It's because people were on edge and people were frightened. And so this isn't a specifically migrant asylum thing, it's just to do with the feeling in Europe, which is different than it used to be.
Yeah, and it's difficult to quantify it. And, obviously, first and foremost, we look at the lives of human beings and those who are wounded or those who are killed. But You know, to me, national security is all-encompassing. It means your economic health and so forth. And when you think of the cost of terrorism on societies, on the transportation sector, on the tourism sector, you know, as I alluded to earlier, my sales pitch with the Mexicans when I first met the intelligence service and sat down in a secret room with them, I said, listen, guys, your number 2 industry behind Pemex is tourism. Europeans and Americans and people from all over the world come to your beaches and come to your resorts. And guess what? After 9/11, they were empty. They were empty. People were frightened. That is part and parcel of what you have to, and it's difficult to quantify those things, but that's what you have to look at, is the impact on the economic health of a country, the attitude, fear. I mean, how do you quantify fear when people take their children to the Louvre and they've got to go through a magnetometer and people are patting them down? Does that impact societies? Absolutely. So,
I actually had a sort of broader question that relates to immigration policy in general. And there's sort of always been a sense that, well, we can always let in the good illegal aliens and keep out the bad illegal aliens. But of course, how the heck do we know who's who? And so, and even as far as regular immigration, you know, I mean, often what you end up with is large immigrant communities serving, as Mao would have said, as the sea within which the fish swim. And so my question is, can you really have large-scale continuing immigration, especially from countries where special interest aliens come from, and not end up with serious terrorism problem inside your country? Any,
who wants to go first?
Well, I'll just throw this out there that really what you're talking about may not even accrue to a violent jihadi threat. MS-13 trying to determine, you know, who the gang members are, who you know, who the rapists are, who the convicted felons are in their own countries. The more volume you have, the more difficult that vetting process is to implement.
and what you described as far as the one-on-one, you know, because obviously you can't call up the Mogadishu DMV and run somebody's driver's license. So if you're talking about, you know, going through the pocket trash, which sort of is kind of an interesting concept, that there'd be anything in somebody's pocket, but I
there's
guess it's
great
possible.
intelligence in
Yeah.
there.
But also, my point is, that's really labor intensive.
Oh, yeah.
And if you're going to do it right, you can't scale that up. I mean, at some point you run out of people to be FBI agents. I mean, you know, there's only 300 million people. You know what I mean? So, anyway, that was kind of my point. Can you really do the kind of oversight and investigation you need, and even things like surveillance within countries once people have already gotten there, if the level of the size of the problem is so big? I mean, I remember reading that the French police ran out of personnel to follow all the people they needed to follow. So anyway, I mean, that was kind of my point, Robin.
I think, the French military have not been able to deploy places overseas because they've had to bring back soldiers to try and keep order better in their home country. I guess a follow-up difficult question is, what would society look like if we did have the suitable resources? Right? I mean, this is one of the things that Europeans are already worrying about, and especially a country like Germany, where there's very recent memories of the Stasi. If they were to deploy the kind of resources they would need to properly keep track of the threat in terms of, I mean, 30 officers for one terror suspect is the basic ratio that's told to me from Europe. If you're to scale that up, I mean, the UK has 23,000 people on the radar. Is it still a free society if your intelligence agencies are so far-reaching?
Could you even hire that many
Right.
security
Probably not.
people?
Probably not.
Right. Yeah.
But I think also it's worth noting, Mark, that Europe's primary response to the terror outbreak of terror attacks was not just to improve vetting, but to just stop the mass migration
Right.
at any cost.
So that's kind of my point.
Right,
is
to
that-
reduce the numbers, and they came up with some creative ways to do it. They're, creating offshore asylum processing centers in places like Rwanda and Niger, and they're sending people there. The Italians cut a deal with the Libyan militias to go to the border and physically stop the migrant flows through that territory.
And aren't all of those kind of things that Europe is doing? See, your point was, what can we learn from that? I mean, we are in fact doing some similar things.
Yeah, bilateral
with-
diplomacy.
Yes, in
absolutely.
Latin
Bilateral
America and the
diplomacy.
Caribbean and what have you. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, you know, 18 years since 9/11, we've gotten better at this game. I remember when I got there right after 9/11, it was starting from ground zero. Some of the things I alluded to, looking at anecdotal evidence and talking to people in the intel community. But we've gotten better. Biometrics have gotten better. Databases have gotten more sophisticated. There's much greater sharing, which the 9/11 Commission pounded on the table about that. Let's stop this stovepiping. And in fairness, there were, you know, in the aftermath of the church hearings, there were a lot of limitations on what the intelligence community and what law enforcement could share. But through the Patriot Act and other things, those laws have changed, and it's made America safer. I mean, I know the FBI has statistically said we've stopped upwards of 100 acts of terrorism in the United States through neutralization and arrest. It's happened. We've gotten better at this game, but the landscape's gotten more sophisticated with cyberspace and ISIS and so forth and so on, but we have gotten better at it, yeah.
Well, thank you. We'll, to respect everybody's time, we'll finish it up here. I appreciate everybody coming. This will be on our website. In fact, I think it already probably is. The paper that Todd published today is on our website, CIS.org. And Robbins at the Heritage Foundation, heritage.org. I assume his work is there. I'm not sure Jim is on the internet, but that's okay. Well, great. Anyway, yeah. So I appreciate everybody coming and hope to see you at our next event. Thank you.
Okay, everybody, that's our report for tonight. Sorry we ran a little long, but we had some internet problems. So we will see you next week, and enjoy the Trump rally tonight. I'm sure you can watch it on the internet too, and there's other places that it'll be available. So turn it on, watch President Trump tonight. He's always entertaining, always right to the point. Thanks very much. See you next week.